Good evening. Tonight, we journey to the coldest circle of hell on earth, to a city that became a graveyard, to a battle that redefined human suffering and endurance. This is not a story of strategy and generals, of grand movements on maps and clean historical narratives. This is a story of frozen corpses, stacked like cordwood, of men eating rats to survive, of fighting room to room, floor to floor, sometimes inch by inch for a single staircase. This is a story of a city that bore the name of a dictator and became his obsession, a place where two ideologies collided with such fury that the very concept of humanity seemed to evaporate in the smoke and snow. Forget everything you think you know about warfare, forget the movies with their dramatic music and clean deaths. The Battle of Stalingrad was something else entirely, something so terrible that survivors on both sides would wake screaming decades later, unable to escape the memories of what they endured in that frozen hell. Before you settle in for this long journey into one of history's darkest moments, take a moment to like this video and subscribe if you find value in these explorations of the past. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from, and what perspective interests you most about this battle. Now, dim the lights, find a comfortable position, and prepare yourself. We are going to Stalingrad, and I cannot promise you will emerge unchanged. Before there was the battle, before there was the hell, there was simply a city. Stalingrad stretched along the western bank of the Volga River for nearly 30 miles, a long, narrow industrial center that had grown rapidly in the decade before the war. The city bore the name of Joseph Stalin, renamed from Tsaritsyn in 1925 to honor the Soviet dictator who had defended it during the Russian Civil War. This was no accident of history. Stalin took the renaming personally, saw the city as an extension of himself, a monument to his power and his vision for the Soviet Union. Stand on the high bank of the Volga in the summer of 1942 before the Germans arrive and look at what Stalingrad was. The river itself is massive here, nearly a mile wide in places, flowing slowly south toward the Caspian Sea. It is the lifeline of southern Russia, carrying grain and oil, connecting the agricultural heartland to the industrial centers. The city that has grown along its western bank is a testament to Soviet industrialization. There is the tractor factory, producing not just tractors but also the T-34 tanks that are the backbone of Soviet armored forces. There is the Red October Steel Works, its blast furnaces glowing day and night. There is the Barricady gun factory, churning out artillery pieces. These are not just factories, they are fortresses, massive complexes of steel and concrete that will soon become the sites of some of the most desperate fighting in human history. Between the factories and the river lie residential districts, workers' housing built quickly and cheaply during the industrialization drives of the 1930s. Wooden houses cluster together, interspersed with newer concrete apartment blocks. There are schools, hospitals, theaters, the normal infrastructure of a Soviet city. In the center of the city rises Mamayev Kurgan, a hill that dominates the surrounding landscape, offering views of the entire city and the river beyond. Whoever controls this hill controls Stalingrad. Both sides will learn this lesson, will fight for this hill with a desperation that defies rational military calculation. The population of Stalingrad in the summer of 1942 is perhaps 400,000 people, though exact numbers are impossible to determine. They are workers and their families, the human machinery of Soviet industry. They live hard lives, as most Soviet citizens do in this era, but they have work, they have food rations, they have a place in the grand socialist experiment. They do not know, cannot know, that their city is about to become synonymous with death, that its very name will make men shudder for generations to come. War comes to Stalingrad slowly, then all at once. In the spring and summer of 1942, the German Wehrmacht launches Case Blue, an offensive designed to capture the oil fields of the Caucasus and cut the Soviet Union off from its primary source of fuel. Army Group South drives east and south, pushing deep into Soviet territory, covering hundreds of miles in weeks. The Soviet forces, still reeling from the disasters of 1941, retreat in disorder. Stalin issues Order 227, the famous not one step back order, threatening commanders with execution if they retreat without authorization, establishing penal battalions for soldiers accused of cowardice. The message is clear, there will be no more retreating. The line must hold. Stalingrad is not initially a primary objective of the German offensive, it is a secondary target, important because of its industrial capacity and because it sits on the Volga, but not the main goal. But as the offensive develops, as German forces approach the city, it takes on symbolic importance far beyond its strategic value. For Hitler, the city bearing Stalin's name becomes an obsession. Capturing it will humiliate his Soviet counterpart, will demonstrate German superiority, will prove that the Wehrmacht can go anywhere, take anything. For Stalin, defending the city becomes a matter of personal pride and political necessity. To lose the city bearing his name would be an unbearable humiliation. The two dictators, neither of whom has ever met, neither of whom understands the other, commit their nations to a battle that neither can afford to lose. In August 1942, the German Sixth Army, commanded by General Friedrich Paulus, approaches Stalingrad from the west. It is a formidable force, over 270,000 men, hundreds of tanks, thousands of artillery pieces, supported by the aircraft of the Luftwaffe's 4th Air Fleet. Paulus is a careful, methodical commander, a staff officer by training, not given to the bold strokes that characterize some of his colleagues. He approaches Stalingrad as he would any other objective, with overwhelming force applied systematically. He does not yet understand that Stalingrad will not be like other battles, that the rules that govern warfare on the open steppe will not apply in the ruins of this city. On August 23, 1942, the Luftwaffe launches a massive air raid on Stalingrad. Over 600 aircraft drop bombs on the city for hours, targeting not just military installations, but the city itself, the residential districts, the civilian population. The city burns, wooden buildings ignite like matchsticks, oil storage tanks explode, sending rivers of burning oil flowing through the streets. The firestorm creates its own weather, winds sucking oxygen from the air, temperatures rising to levels that melt metal. Thousands of civilians die in this single day, buried in collapsed buildings, burned alive in their homes, suffocated in bomb shelters, where the fire consumes all available oxygen. The survivors flee toward the river, crowding onto the banks, trying to cross on ferries and barges under constant air attack. Many drown, many more are killed by bombs and strafing aircraft. The city that had been home to 400,000 people becomes a death trap for tens of thousands in a single afternoon. The bombing of August 23 is not a military necessity. The city's defenses are not particularly strong. The factories can be captured intact if the Germans approach methodically. But Hitler wants the city destroyed, wants its population terrorized, wants Stalin to see his namesake city burning. The bombing achieves this goal, but it also creates something the Germans do not anticipate, a landscape perfectly suited for defensive warfare. The ruins provide cover and concealment. The rubble creates obstacles that channel attacking forces into killing zones. The destroyed buildings become fortresses, each one a potential strongpoint that must be taken room by room, floor by floor. In their eagerness to destroy Stalingrad, the Germans create the conditions for their own destruction. The initial defense of Stalingrad falls to the 62nd Army, commanded by General Vasily Chuikov, a tough, profane veteran who understands urban warfare instinctively. Chuikov is not a sophisticated military theorist. He is a brawler, a man who believes in getting close to the enemy, in fighting at such short range that the Germans cannot use their artillery and air support without hitting their own troops. He develops tactics specifically for urban combat, tactics that will be studied and copied by military forces around the world for decades to come. Chuikov's philosophy is simple: hold the city at any cost, fight for every building, never retreat. He moves his headquarters close to the front lines, sometimes within sight of German positions, to show his troops that he shares their danger. He organizes his forces into small assault groups, typically 6 to 10 men, armed with submachine guns, grenades and knives, trained to fight at close quarters, to infiltrate enemy positions, to turn the rubble into a three-dimensional battlefield where the Germans' advantages in firepower and organization become liabilities. But tactics and leadership can only do so much when the enemy has overwhelming superiority in numbers and equipment. In the early days of the battle, the situation for the 62nd Army is desperate. German forces push into the city from the west and north, driving toward the Volga, trying to cut the Soviet forces off from their supply lines across the river. The fighting is brutal from the beginning. Buildings change hands multiple times in a single day. A factory workshop might be held by Germans in the morning, Soviets at noon, Germans again by evening. There are no front lines in the traditional sense, just a chaotic jumble of strongpoints and no man's lands, with both sides occupying different floors of the same building, separated only by rubble and a staircase. The soldiers who fight in Stalingrad are not the well-trained, well-equipped troops of propaganda. They are often poorly trained conscripts, peasants and factory workers, given a rifle and a few days of instruction before being thrown into combat. Many do not even have rifles. The famous Soviet practice of sending men into battle unarmed, expecting them to pick up weapons from the dead, is not entirely myth. Ammunition is always short. Food is scarce. Medical care is primitive at best. The wounded often die not from their injuries, but from exposure, bleeding out in the ruins, because no one can reach them, because the medics are overwhelmed, because there are simply too many casualties, and not enough hands to help them all. The psychological toll on the defenders is immense. These men are fighting not just for their lives, but for their families, for their country, for a cause they have been told is worth dying for. Soviet propaganda is relentless. There is no land beyond the Volga, no place to retreat, no alternative to victory or death. Political officers, the Zampolits, move among the troops, watching for signs of defeatism, ready to shoot anyone who suggests retreat. NKVD blocking detachments are positioned behind Soviet lines, with orders to shoot anyone who falls back without authorization. The message is clear: the Germans might kill you, but we definitely will if you run. Yet despite the terror, despite the overwhelming odds, many Soviet soldiers fight with a ferocity that surprises the Germans. Some fight because they believe in the Soviet cause, because they have been told that the Nazis will enslave or exterminate the Russian people, that this is a war of survival. Others fight because they have no choice, because retreat means execution. Still others fight because their comrades are fighting, because to run would be to abandon men who have become brothers in this shared hell. And some fight because they have simply been broken by the experience, have moved beyond fear and hope into a kind of mechanical existence, where following orders is the only thing that makes sense in a world that has lost all meaning. The main defensive line of Stalingrad runs through the factory district in the northern part of the city. The tractor factory, the Barricade gun factory, and the Red October steelworks are massive complexes, each covering dozens of acres, built of steel and reinforced concrete, designed to withstand the harsh conditions of industrial production, but perfectly suited for military defense. The Soviets fortify these factories, turning them into fortresses, installing machine gun nests in the workshops, positioning snipers in the rafters, laying mines in the approaches, creating killing zones in the courtyards and assembly halls. The battle for the factories begins in September, and continues through October and into November. It is some of the most intense urban combat in history. The fighting is not just building to building, but room to room, sometimes hand to hand with knives and entrenching tools when ammunition runs out. A single workshop might take days to capture, with Germans holding one end and Soviets the other, neither side able to advance more than a few meters despite repeated attacks. The dead pile up so quickly that both sides simply fight over and around them, using corpses as cover, too exhausted and too busy to bury the fallen. The conditions inside the factories defy description. The noise is constant and overwhelming. The crack of rifles, the chatter of machine guns, the crash of grenades and artillery shells, the screams of the wounded and dying. The air is thick with smoke and dust, making it difficult to breathe, impossible to see more than a few meters. The smell is indescribable, a mixture of cordite, burning metal, decomposing bodies, and human waste. There is no sanitation, no running water, no facilities of any kind. Men relieve themselves where they stand. The wounded lie where they fall, crying for water, for morphine, for their mothers, until they die, or someone manages to drag them to an aid station. The Germans throw everything they have at the factories. Infantry assaults are supported by tanks, artillery, combat engineers with flamethrowers and demolition charges. They blast their way forward, room by room, using explosives to create new passages through walls when doors and corridors are blocked. The Soviets counterattack constantly, launching small raids and larger assaults, trying to push the Germans back, to recapture lost ground, to keep the enemy off balance. Sometimes these counterattacks succeed, pushing the Germans back a few meters, recapturing a workshop or a section of wall. More often they fail, leaving more Soviet dead piled in the ruins. The battle for the tractor factory is typical of the fighting throughout the city. The factory complex is enormous, a maze of workshops, warehouses, office buildings, and open yards. The Germans attack from the west, advancing through the residential district that surrounds the factory, fighting for every house, every garden, every fence. When they reach the factory walls, they blast through with artillery and assault guns, then pour infantry into the breaches. The Soviets fight back from prepared positions, from behind overturned machinery, from piles of scrap metal, from the shadows of blast furnaces that no longer operate, but still provide cover. One Soviet soldier later describes the fighting. We fought for every brick, every plank of wood, every scrap of metal. The Germans would take a building in the morning, and we would counterattack and drive them out in the afternoon. Then they would attack again at night and push us back. This went on for days, for weeks. You stopped thinking about tomorrow, stopped thinking about home. There was only now, only this moment, this room, this wall, kill or be killed. Everything else disappeared. The psychological strain on soldiers on both sides reaches breaking points that military psychiatrists will study for decades. Men develop what will later be called combat stress reaction or post-traumatic stress disorder, but in 1942 it is simply called being finished or having had enough. They stare at nothing, respond to no orders, cannot eat or sleep. Some simply walk away from their positions, wandering into no man's land where they are killed by one side or the other. Others break down completely, crying uncontrollably, screaming, or becoming catatonic. The Germans call it front collapse. The Soviets call it contusion. Both sides shoot men who refuse to fight, but many commanders quietly evacuate the worst cases, recognizing that even the strongest mind can be broken by enough exposure to this hell. As September turns to October and October bleeds into November, the weather changes. The autumn rains begin, turning the rubble into a sea of mud, making movement difficult, making life even more miserable than it already is. Then, in early November, the temperature drops, winter arrives in Stalingrad, and with it comes a new dimension of suffering that neither side is prepared for. The German soldiers, many of them still wearing the summer uniforms they were issued in August, are completely unprepared for a Russian winter. Hitler and his generals believed the Soviet Union would collapse before winter arrived, that the war would be over by autumn. Warm clothing exists in warehouses in Germany, but getting it to the front lines requires a logistics network that is already stretched to the breaking point. The railway lines run through partisan-infested territory. The trucks that bring supplies forward break down constantly. The winter equipment that does arrive is never enough, never distributed fairly, never reaches the men who need it most desperately. The cold in Stalingrad during winter is not the romantic, picturesque cold of a Christmas card. It is brutal, deadly, unrelenting. Temperatures drop to 20, 30, 40 degrees below 0 Celsius. The wind that blows across the steppe has nothing to slow it, no forests or hills to break its force, and it cuts through clothing like a knife. Men wake in the morning to find their eyelashes frozen together. Moisture from their breath forms icicles in their beards. Exposed skin develops frostbite in minutes. Fingers and toes turn white, then black, then simply stop working. The Soviet soldiers are better equipped for winter, having winter coats and felt boots, but they too suffer terribly from the cold. Food is scarce on both sides. The calories needed to maintain body heat in these temperatures are enormous, but rations are minimal. Men burn thousands of calories a day just trying to stay alive, and their bodies begin to consume themselves. They grow thin, skeletal, their faces hollow, their eyes sunken. They move slowly, conserving energy, performing only the minimum actions necessary for survival. Finding shelter becomes an obsession for both sides. The destroyed buildings of Stalingrad offer some protection from the wind, but most have no roofs, no windows, no doors. Soldiers huddle in basements, in cellars, in any space that offers even minimal protection from the elements. They burn anything combustible for heat, furniture, books, wooden beams pulled from ruins, even the bodies of the dead when nothing else is available. The fires produce smoke that reveals positions to enemy snipers and artillery observers, but the alternative is freezing to death, so they burn what they can and accept the risk. The Volga River, which has been the Soviet lifeline throughout the battle, begins to freeze. At first, ice forms along the banks, then extends gradually toward the center of the river. The ferries and barges that have been bringing supplies and reinforcements to the 62nd Army struggle to navigate through the ice flows. Some are crushed. Others become trapped, helpless targets for German artillery. The crossing becomes even more dangerous than it already was, and it was already a journey that many did not survive. When the river finally freezes solid in late November, it creates new opportunities and new dangers for both sides. The Soviets can now bring supplies across on sleds and trucks, no longer dependent on boats that can be sunk, but the Germans can potentially cross the ice as well, can threaten the Soviet rear areas on the eastern bank. Both sides mine the ice, creating deadly fields that claim tanks and trucks and men who step in the wrong place. The frozen Volga becomes another battlefield, another place where men die in the cold and dark. Food becomes an obsession that overwhelms every other consideration. The official rations for both armies are inadequate at best, and often they do not arrive at all. German supply lines are stretched impossibly thin, running back hundreds of miles through hostile territory. Soviet supply lines require crossing the Volga under constant fire. What food does arrive is often frozen solid, inedible without time and fuel to thaw it, and there is never enough time, never enough fuel. Soldiers on both sides begin to hunt rats. The ruins of Stalingrad are infested with them, fat, well-fed rats that feast on the abundant corpses. The rats are dangerous to catch, aggressive and surprisingly large, but they are meat, they are protein, they are calories that might keep a man alive one more day. Men fashion traps from wire and debris. They hunt the rats with clubs and knives. They roast them over small fires and eat them without ceremony, without seasoning, sometimes without cooking them fully, because fuel is too precious to waste. The dead are everywhere in Stalingrad, so numerous that burial becomes impossible. In the summer and autumn, the bodies decompose quickly, creating a stench that hangs over the city like a fog. In winter they freeze solid, preserved by the cold, becoming part of the landscape. Men use corpses as firing positions, propping them up to draw enemy fire, hiding behind them for cover. They strip the dead of anything useful: weapons, ammunition, food, clothing, boots. A dead man's coat might mean the difference between life and death for someone still fighting. There is no room for sentiment, no time for mourning. The dead are resources to be exploited, obstacles to be navigated around, reminders of what awaits everyone eventually. Some corpses are German, some Soviet, but most are civilians, the people of Stalingrad who did not evacuate, who could not evacuate, who remained in the city when the battle began and died in the crossfire, or from hunger, or from cold, or from the thousands of other ways that war kills the innocent. Their bodies lie in basements and on street corners, in collapsed buildings and open squares. No one counts them. No one records their names. They are simply gone, erased from existence, leaving behind only the frozen shells that were once human beings. The psychological impact of living among so many dead, of using corpses as tools and furniture, of becoming completely desensitized to death, leaves marks on the survivors that never fully heal. Men who fought in Stalingrad describe a sensation of becoming less than human, of losing some essential part of themselves in the ruins, of crossing a line that can never be uncrossed. They ate rats and fought over garbage, and killed without hesitation, and watched their friends die, and felt nothing, because to feel anything was to invite madness, and they needed to stay sane just a little longer, just until the next day, just until the battle ended. On November 19th, 1942, everything changes. The Soviets launch Operation Uranus, a massive counteroffensive designed not to recapture Stalingrad directly, but to encircle the entire German Sixth Army. Soviet forces strike from the north and south, attacking not the German army in Stalingrad, but the weaker Romanian armies that protect its flanks. The Romanian troops, poorly equipped and poorly led, collapse almost immediately. Within 4 days, the Soviet pincers meet west of Stalingrad, and the trap snaps shut. Nearly 300,000 German and Axis soldiers are now surrounded, cut off from their supply lines, trapped in and around a ruined city with winter closing in. Hitler orders the Sixth Army to hold its position, forbids any attempt to break out, promises that the Luftwaffe will supply the trapped army by air. Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, assures the Führer that his aircraft can deliver 500 tons of supplies per day, the minimum needed to sustain the encircled forces. This is a lie, or perhaps a delusion. Göring does not understand the logistics, does not comprehend the distances involved, does not account for the weather, and the Soviet air defenses, and the simple impossibility of what he is promising. The Luftwaffe will never come close to delivering the promised supplies. The Sixth Army is doomed from the moment the encirclement is complete, though it will take 2 more months of suffering for that doom to become undeniable. General Paulus, the Sixth Army commander, understands immediately that his position is untenable. He requests permission to break out, to fight his way west, while his army still has the strength to do so. Hitler refuses. Stalingrad has become more than a military objective. It has become a symbol, a test of wills between Hitler and Stalin, and Hitler will not permit retreat under any circumstances. Paulus is ordered to hold, to trust in the Luftwaffe, to wait for relief that is already being organized. Like a good German officer, trained to obey orders without question, Paulus complies. His army will pay the price for his obedience. For the soldiers trapped in the pocket, The encirclement means a fundamental change in their reality. Until now they have been attacking, advancing, conquering. They have believed in ultimate victory, in the superiority of German arms, in the inevitability of their success. Now suddenly they are the ones surrounded, the ones cut off, the ones facing annihilation. The psychological impact is devastating. Morale, already strained by months of brutal urban combat, collapses. Men who have fought with courage and determination for weeks suddenly lose the will to continue. What is the point of fighting if defeat is inevitable? What is the point of dying in this frozen hell when the war is already lost? The Soviet soldiers in Stalingrad, who have been on the defensive for months, who have been pushed back step by bloody step, suddenly find their situation transformed. They are no longer the ones being annihilated. Now they are the annihilators. The change in morale is immediate and dramatic. Men who have been exhausted, demoralized, ready to give up, suddenly find new reserves of strength and determination. They attack with renewed fury, sensing victory, smelling the blood of a wounded enemy. The battle for Stalingrad enters its final, most terrible phase. The supply situation for the trapped Sixth Army deteriorates with shocking speed. The Luftwaffe's transport aircraft, mainly Junkers Ju-52 Tremotors, designed to carry freight in peacetime, face impossible conditions. The nearest German held airfields are over 200 kilometers from Stalingrad. The aircraft must fly through terrible weather, through Soviet fighter patrols and anti-aircraft fire, to reach the improvised airstrips inside the pocket. Many are shot down. Others crash in the snow and fog. Still others land safely, but are destroyed on the ground by Soviet artillery or air attacks. The few aircraft that make it through carry far less than promised, often arriving with ammunition when food is desperately needed, or with food when ammunition has run out. The official German ration for troops in Stalingrad is reduced again and again as the reality of the supply situation becomes undeniable. First to 300 grams of bread per day, then to 200, then to 100. Men are expected to fight on portions that would barely sustain a sedentary civilian in peacetime. In the cold of a Russian winter, performing heavy physical labor, burning thousands of calories just trying to stay warm. These rations are a slow death sentence. The human body begins to consume itself, breaking down muscle tissue to maintain essential functions. The men grow weak, then weaker still, then so weak that simple tasks become impossible. Hunger becomes the overwhelming reality of existence, the thought that occupies every waking moment and intrudes into what little sleep the soldiers manage. Men dream of food, elaborate fantasies of meals they have eaten in the past, or hope to eat in the future. They talk about food constantly, describe in excruciating detail the dishes their mothers or wives prepared, torture themselves with memories of abundance that seems to belong to another lifetime. Some men keep diaries where they record not the events of the battle but recipes, detailed instructions for preparing dishes they will never eat again. The horses are slaughtered first, the thousands of animals used to pull artillery and supply wagons. Horse meat is not part of the normal German ration, but starving men do not care about dietary preferences. The horses are killed and butchered and distributed to the troops, and for a few days the ration situation improves slightly, but there are only so many horses, and they are gone quickly. Then the soldiers turn to anything else that might be edible. They boil leather boots and belts to extract whatever nutrition might remain in the hide. They eat the paste used to attach posters to walls made from flour and water, scraping it off and consuming it despite the ink and paper fibers mixed in. They eat grass and tree bark when they can find anything green beneath the snow. Diseases of malnutrition appear with terrifying rapidity. Scurvy, caused by vitamin C deficiency, makes men's gums bleed and their teeth fall out, causes old wounds to reopen, saps their strength. Beriberi, from lack of thiamine, causes nerve damage and heart problems. Edema, caused by protein deficiency, makes their limbs swell grotesquely, filling with fluid that the starving body can no longer process properly. Men look at their comrades and see walking corpses, skin stretched tight over skulls, eyes sunken deep in their sockets, every bone visible through skin that has lost all its fat. The cold makes the hunger worse, or perhaps the hunger makes the cold worse, the two conditions feeding on each other in a vicious cycle. A well-fed body can generate heat, can maintain its core temperature even in extreme cold. A starving body cannot. The metabolism slows to conserve energy, but this means less heat production, which means greater vulnerability to cold, which means the body must burn more calories to stay warm, which means faster starvation. Men freeze to death in their sleep, their bodies simply unable to generate enough heat to survive the night. Others lose fingers and toes and entire limbs to frostbite, the flesh turning black and dead, falling off in chunks, leaving stumps that cannot be properly treated, because there are no medical supplies, no surgeons, no anesthesia. The starving men become prone to illness and infection. Their immune systems, deprived of the nutrients needed to function properly, cannot fight off the diseases that spread rapidly in the crowded, unsanitary conditions of the pocket. Dysentery sweeps through the German positions, leaving men too weak to stand, too weak even to control their bowels. They lie in their own filth, unable to care for themselves, waiting for death or for a comrade to find them and drag them to an aid station where nothing can be done because there are no medicines, no fluids, no way to treat the thousands of sick and dying. Some men, driven mad by hunger, do things that would have been unthinkable weeks earlier. There are reports, impossible to verify but persistent in the accounts of survivors, of cannibalism in the pocket. Men cutting flesh from dead comrades and eating it raw or roasted over small fires. German military authorities deny these reports, call them Soviet propaganda, but the soldiers know better. They have seen things they will never speak of, have crossed lines that can never be uncrossed, have done what was necessary to survive just one more day in the hell of Stalingrad. The medical situation in the pocket is beyond catastrophic. The German Sixth Army has entered the battle with field hospitals, surgical teams, medical supplies adequate for a normal campaign. But Stalingrad is not a normal campaign, and the casualties far exceed anything the medical services were designed to handle. By December, the hospitals are overwhelmed, flooded with wounded men far beyond their capacity to treat. The doctors and medics do what they can, but what they can do becomes less and less as supplies run out and conditions deteriorate. The wounded lie on floors, in corridors, in cellars, anywhere there is space. There are not enough beds, not enough blankets, not enough of anything. Men with serious wounds that require surgery cannot be operated on because there is no anesthesia, or because the surgeons are too exhausted to perform another operation, or because there are simply too many wounded and not enough hands to help them all. Amputations are performed without anesthesia, with the patient held down by several orderlies while the surgeon saws through bone as quickly as possible. Many patients die from shock during these operations. Others die afterward from infection, because there are no antibiotics, no way to prevent wounds from becoming infected in the filthy conditions of the pocket. The cold makes everything worse. The hospitals have no heat, or inadequate heat, and wounded men freeze as they wait for treatment. Frostbite injuries compound battle wounds, requiring additional amputations, creating additional suffering. Gangrene sets in rapidly in frozen flesh, necessitating the removal of limbs that might have been saved in warmer conditions. The smell in the hospitals is indescribable, a mixture of gangrenous flesh, unwashed bodies, human waste and death. The orderlies do what they can to maintain sanitation, but it is an impossible task. There is no running water, no adequate waste disposal, no way to keep the facilities clean. The wounded who cannot be treated, who are judged too severely injured to survive, are separated from the rest and left to die. This triage is necessary when resources are limited, but it is also a kind of murder, a decision that some men will live and others will die based on calculations of who is most likely to survive and who might be able to return to combat. The dying men are given morphine if any is available, to ease their passing, but often there is no morphine, and they simply lie in agony until death releases them. The psychological toll on the medical personnel is immense. Doctors and nurses trained to save lives are forced to watch men die because they lack the resources to help them. They make decisions about who receives treatment and who does not, knowing that these decisions are death sentences for many. They work without rest, without adequate food, without hope, performing surgery by candlelight, amputating limbs with saws designed for cutting wood, doing everything possible with nothing available. Many break under the strain, develop what we would now call PTSD, become unable to function, have to be evacuated if evacuation is even possible. The lightly wounded, men who might recover with proper treatment and rest, are kept in the pocket because the Luftwaffe aircraft that bring supplies in take wounded out, but there is only room for the most serious cases, for men who will die without immediate evacuation. The walking wounded, men with injuries that are painful but not immediately life-threatening, remain with their units, expected to continue fighting despite their wounds. Many of these men develop infections, see their minor injuries become major ones, die from wounds that should not have been fatal. Others are killed in subsequent fighting, their wounds making them slower, clumsier, less able to defend themselves. The truly terrible thing about the medical situation in the pocket is not just the suffering it causes, but the knowledge that it is unnecessary. These men are dying not because their wounds are inherently fatal, but because they are trapped, because Hitler refuses to authorize a breakout, because the Luftwaffe cannot supply the pocket, because the relief attempts fail. They are dying from a combination of wounds, cold, hunger, and neglect that could be avoided if the army were allowed to retreat, to preserve itself to fight another day, but that option is not available. Hitler has decreed that the Sixth Army will hold Stalingrad, and so these men will die here, slowly and terribly, for no military purpose whatsoever. As 1942 turns to 1943, the Soviet forces begin their final push to eliminate the pocket. The Germans are now divided into two separate groups, one in the northern part of the city around the factories, one in the southern part. The Soviets attack both groups simultaneously, grinding them down, reducing the pocket day by day, mile by mile, building by building. The German resistance, fierce and desperate at first, begins to weaken as starvation and cold do what Soviet attacks could not. Units cease to exist as organized formations, companies are reduced to a dozen men. Battalions cease to exist. Men fight alone or in small groups, disconnected from any larger command structure, simply trying to stay alive one more day, one more hour. The Soviet tactics are brutal but effective. They surround German strongpoints, cut them off, bombard them with artillery until the defenders are buried or stunned or dead, then assault with infantry supported by tanks. The Germans, lacking ammunition, lacking food, lacking the strength to resist, surrender in increasing numbers. Some units fight to the last man, following their orders to hold at all costs. Others surrender as soon as Soviet troops appear, grateful for the chance to end their suffering even if it means captivity and an uncertain fate. By late January, the pocket has been reduced to a few square kilometers in the city center. Nearly 100,000 German soldiers are packed into this tiny area, surrounded by Soviet forces, subjected to constant artillery bombardment, with no hope of relief or escape. The conditions defy description. Dead bodies are stacked like cordwood, because there is no way to bury them. The living huddle in cellars and ruins, burning whatever they can find for heat, eating whatever they can scavenge, waiting for the end that everyone knows is inevitable. On January 31, 1943, General Paulus surrenders. He does so reluctantly, still bound by his oath to Hitler, still believing somehow that he is betraying his trust by giving up. Hitler has promoted him to Field Marshal the day before, a cynical move meant to encourage him to commit suicide, as no German Field Marshal has ever been captured alive. Paulus refuses to kill himself, chooses captivity over death, and with his surrender the northern pocket collapses. 2 days later, on February 2nd, the southern pocket surrenders as well. The Battle of Stalingrad is over. The casualties are almost beyond comprehension. The German Sixth Army entered the battle with nearly 300,000 men. Only about 90,000 survived, to be taken prisoner, and of these fewer than 6,000 would ever see Germany again. The rest died during the battle, or in Soviet captivity, from wounds, from starvation, from disease, from the march to prison camps in conditions as terrible as anything they experienced in the pocket. Soviet casualties were even higher, perhaps 1.1 million killed, wounded, or captured over the entire course of the battle. Civilian casualties are impossible to calculate, but certainly number in the tens of thousands, possibly higher. The city itself is completely destroyed. Not a single building remains undamaged. The factories are twisted metal ruins. The residential districts are fields of rubble. The great city that stretched along the Volga for 30 miles has ceased to exist, has been reduced to a wasteland of broken concrete and frozen corpses and twisted metal. It will take decades to rebuild, and even then, the city that rises from the ruins will never be the same as the one that existed before the battle. Now, having followed this descent into hell, having witnessed the full horror of the Battle of Stalingrad, we must return to our original question: why would you not survive a night in this battle? The answer should be obvious by now, but let us be explicit about the specific ways that Stalingrad would kill you. An ordinary person transported from the relative safety and comfort of the modern world into the worst battle in human history. First and most obviously, you would likely die from enemy action. The battle produces casualties at a rate that defies comprehension. On some days, entire battalions cease to exist. Thousands of men killed in a few hours of fighting. The chances of surviving any single engagement might be reasonable, but you would face dozens, hundreds of engagements. The law of averages catches up with everyone. A bullet, a shell fragment, a collapsing building, a stray round from a machine gun, any of 1,000 different causes of death would find you eventually. Even if you were skilled, trained, experienced, the odds would be against you. Being none of those things, being just an ordinary person, your chances of surviving more than a few days of actual combat are essentially zero. But you would not need to die in combat, to die in Stalingrad. The cold would kill you with equal efficiency. Modern humans, especially those from developed countries, have little experience with genuine survival cold. You have central heating, warm clothing, the ability to go inside when temperatures drop. In Stalingrad, there is no inside, or rather inside offers only marginally more protection than outside. The buildings have no heat, no windows, no doors, the wind blows through them unobstructed. The temperatures drop to levels that kill in hours without proper clothing and shelter. You would develop frostbite, would lose fingers and toes, would eventually lose so much body heat that your core temperature would drop, and you would simply stop functioning, would fall asleep and never wake up. Hunger would kill you perhaps more slowly than bullets or cold, but just as certainly. The rations available in the pocket during the final months are inadequate to sustain life. You would starve, not dramatically, but gradually, your body consuming itself, your strength failing day by day, until you could no longer stand, could no longer walk, could no longer perform even the basic functions necessary for survival. And unlike the soldiers around you, you would have no training in how to survive on minimal rations, no experience with real hunger, no mental toughness built up over months or years of military service. You would break quickly, would give up, would lie down and wait for death, because continuing would require reserves of willpower and determination that you simply do not possess. Disease would kill you. The unsanitary conditions, the crowding, the lack of clean water and adequate hygiene, the presence of thousands of corpses breeding bacteria and parasites, all of these create an environment where disease spreads rapidly. Dysentery, typhus, pneumonia, infections from minor wounds that become major ones, any of these could kill you. Modern humans rely on antibiotics and vaccines and modern medicine to protect them from diseases that once killed millions. In Stalingrad, you would have none of these protections. A simple infected cut could turn septic, could poison your blood, could kill you as surely as a bullet, but perhaps most likely, you would die from psychological collapse. The human mind is not designed to endure the level of stress and horror present in Stalingrad. The constant danger, the inability to rest or feel safe even for a moment, the sights and sounds and smells of mass death, the knowledge that you are trapped with no hope of escape, all of these would break you mentally long before they killed you physically. You would develop what we now call acute stress reaction or combat stress reaction, what the soldiers called being shell-shocked or having had enough. You would stop functioning as a rational human being. You might freeze up, unable to move or act even when action is necessary for survival. You might break down completely, crying or screaming, or becoming catatonic, or you might simply lose the will to live, might decide that death is preferable to continuing in this hell, might stop fighting and let yourself die. The soldiers who survived Stalingrad, on both sides, were not supermen. They were ordinary people pushed to extraordinary extremes, who endured things that should not be endurable, who kept fighting when fighting seemed pointless, who maintained their humanity in an environment designed to destroy it. But they had advantages you do not have. They had training, discipline, unit cohesion, leadership, a sense of duty or patriotism, or simple obedience that kept them going when every instinct screamed to give up. You would have none of these things. You would be alone, untrained, unprepared, dropped into the worst possible circumstances with no support and no hope. The surrender of the Sixth Army does not end the suffering of its soldiers. For the 90,000 men who survived to be taken prisoner, a new nightmare begins, one that in some ways is worse than the battle itself. The Soviet forces, themselves exhausted and undersupplied, are completely unprepared to handle this many prisoners. They have no food to spare, no medical facilities adequate to treat the tens of thousands of wounded, no transportation to move the prisoners to camps in the rear areas. The prisoners must walk, must march hundreds of miles through the frozen steppe to reach the prison camps, and many do not survive the journey. The march begins immediately after the surrender. The German prisoners are formed into columns and directed east, away from the ruins of Stalingrad, toward an uncertain fate. They are given no food, no water, no time to rest or prepare. Many are wounded, some seriously, unable to walk without assistance. Others are sick with dysentery, or typhus, or pneumonia. Still others are simply too weak from starvation to maintain the pace. These men fall behind, collapse in the snow, are left where they fall. The Soviet guards, themselves hungry and cold and exhausted, have neither the resources nor the inclination to help. A prisoner who cannot keep up is a prisoner who dies. It is that simple. The weather during the march is brutally cold, temperatures well below freezing, wind cutting across the open steppe, with nothing to block it. The prisoners, many still wearing the inadequate summer uniforms they were issued months earlier, have no protection against this cold. They stumble forward in a daze, feet wrapped in rags because their boots have long since worn through, hands thrust into armpits in a futile attempt to maintain warmth. Ice forms in their beards and eyebrows. Frostbite blackens their fingers and toes and faces. Men go blind as their eyes freeze. Others lose the ability to speak, their vocal cords damaged by breathing air so cold it burns. The prisoners die by the thousands during the march. Some simply stop, sit down in the snow, and freeze to death within minutes. Others collapse while walking, and are trampled by those behind them, too weak to get up, too numerous for the guards to clear from the path. Still others wander off the road in a delirium, confused and disoriented, and are never seen again, their bodies lost in the vast whiteness of the steppe. The Soviets make no effort to count the dead, to record who dies or where or how. The bodies are simply left where they fall, to be buried by snow, or discovered by wolves, or to lie frozen until spring, when they will decompose and disappear. Those who survive the march arrive at transit camps that are little better than open pens, barbed wire enclosures, with no shelter, no heat, minimal food. The prisoners are packed together, thousands of men in spaces designed for hundreds, standing room only because there is not enough space for everyone to lie down. They stand pressed against each other, using shared body heat to stay alive, but even this is not enough. Men die standing up, their bodies held upright by the press of living prisoners around them, not discovered until morning, when the crowd shifts and the corpses fall. The Soviet guards at these camps are themselves often prisoners, former kulaks or political prisoners given the task of guarding German POWs. They have no love for the Germans, no sympathy for their suffering. Many are brutal, beating prisoners for minor infractions or for no reason at all, stealing what little the prisoners still possess, denying them food or water as punishment. Others are simply indifferent, doing the minimum required by their orders, watching dispassionately as the prisoners die in droves. The death rate in these transit camps approaches 50% in the first weeks after the surrender. Half of the men who survived the battle, who survived the march, die within a month of becoming prisoners. The prisoners who survive the transit camps are eventually moved to permanent prison camps, scattered across the Soviet Union, from the Urals to Siberia to Central Asia. These camps are part of the vast Gulag system, designed to extract labor from prisoners while providing minimal resources for their survival. The German POWs are put to work immediately, building roads, mining coal, cutting timber, performing the heavy manual labor that the Soviet economy requires but cannot staff with free workers. The conditions in these camps are only marginally better than in the transit camps. The barracks are unheated or inadequately heated, overcrowded, infested with lice and bedbugs. The food is barely sufficient to sustain life, typically consisting of a thin soup made from cabbage or other vegetables, a small piece of bread, sometimes a bit of fish or meat if the prisoners are fortunate. The rations are calculated to provide just enough calories to keep a man alive and working, but not enough to restore health or build strength. The prisoners exist in a state of chronic semi-starvation, always hungry, always weak, always on the edge of collapse. The work the prisoners are required to perform is brutally hard, especially for men already weakened by months of combat and starvation. They work 10, 12, sometimes 14 hours a day, in all weather, with inadequate tools and no safety equipment. They dig ditches in frozen ground, fell trees in forests where temperatures drop to 40 below, mine coal in shafts that collapse regularly, crushing or burying the workers. The Soviet guards care nothing for the prisoners' safety or well-being. Dead prisoners can be replaced. There are always more prisoners. Disease runs rampant through the camps. Typhus, spread by lice that infest every prisoner and every piece of clothing, kills thousands. Dysentery, caused by contaminated food and water and poor sanitation, kills thousands more. Tuberculosis spreads easily in the overcrowded, poorly ventilated barracks, attacking lungs already weakened by cold and malnutrition. Prisoners with serious illnesses are sometimes isolated, but more often they are simply left with the general population, to infect others or to die, whichever comes first. Medical care is minimal to non-existent. The camp doctors, often prisoners themselves, lack medicines, lack equipment, lack everything necessary to actually treat the sick. They can diagnose, they can observe, they can record the deaths, but they can rarely heal. The psychological toll of captivity is as devastating as the physical toll. The prisoners have lost everything: their freedom, their country, their comrades, their dignity. They are completely powerless, subject to the whims of guards who may be cruel or indifferent but are never sympathetic. They do not know if they will ever be released, if they will ever see home again, if their families even know they are alive. Many sink into depression, losing the will to live, simply giving up. They stop eating, stop working, stop caring what happens to them. These men die quickly, within days or weeks, their bodies shutting down once their minds have surrendered. Others survive through a kind of mental compartmentalization, focusing obsessively on small tasks or routines, creating structure and meaning in a world that has none. They make plans for what they will do when they are released, even though release seems impossibly distant. They remember their lives before the war in minute detail, rehearsing memories over and over to keep them fresh, to maintain some connection to who they were before Stalingrad destroyed them. They form friendships with other prisoners, small groups of men who look out for each other, share what little they have, provide emotional support in a world that offers none. Some prisoners attempt to escape, despite the impossibility of success. Where would they go? They are thousands of miles from Germany, in the middle of Soviet territory, speaking no Russian, with no resources, and no help available. Yet still they try, driven by desperation or hope, or simple refusal to accept captivity. Nearly all are caught within days or hours. The punishment for attempted escape is severe: beatings, solitary confinement, execution in some cases. The Soviets make examples of escapees, parading them before other prisoners, demonstrating what happens to those who try to run. Yet still, occasionally, someone tries, because the alternative is to accept that this camp, this life, will be their reality, until they die. For most of the Stalingrad prisoners, captivity lasts not months but years. The first prisoners are not released until 1949, 7 years after the battle. The last prisoners do not return to Germany until 1955, over 12 years after their capture. During these years, thousands more die from disease, from malnutrition, from accidents, from the accumulated effects of their captivity. Of the 90,000 men taken prisoner at Stalingrad, fewer than 6,000 eventually return to Germany. The rest die in captivity, are buried in unmarked graves across the Soviet Union, are lost to history. The prisoners who do survive to be released are changed almost beyond recognition. They are old men, though many are only in their 30s or 40s. Years of malnutrition have permanently damaged their bodies. Their teeth have fallen out from scurvy. Their bones are brittle from lack of calcium. Their organs are damaged from chronic disease. Many have permanent disabilities, missing fingers or toes or limbs lost to frostbite, lung damage from tuberculosis, heart damage from the strain of years of hard labor on inadequate nutrition. They look 20 or 30 years older than their actual ages, their faces lined and weathered, their bodies bent and broken. The psychological scars are even deeper than the physical ones. These men have experienced traumas that would break most people: the horror of the battle, the suffering of starvation and cold, the humiliation and degradation of captivity, the loss of their youth and health and hope. Many suffer from what we would now diagnose as PTSD, experiencing flashbacks and nightmares, unable to adjust to normal civilian life, unable to form relationships or hold jobs or function in society. Some turn to alcohol to numb the memories, drinking themselves to death within years of their release. Others commit suicide, unable to live with what they have experienced, unable to find meaning or purpose in a world that no longer makes sense to them. The returning prisoners find that Germany itself has changed beyond recognition. The country they left no longer exists. Germany has been divided, occupied by the victorious Allies, its cities destroyed by bombing, its economy shattered, its society transformed. The survivors of Stalingrad return to a world that has moved on without them, where their experiences are viewed with suspicion or indifference, where they are seen as embarrassing reminders of a war that Germany wants to forget. Many find that their families have given them up for dead, that their wives have remarried, that their children do not remember them. They are strangers in their own land, ghosts of a past that everyone wants to bury. Some of the survivors try to speak about their experiences, to bear witness to what happened at Stalingrad and in the prison camps. They write memoirs, give interviews, speak to historians and journalists. Their accounts are harrowing, filled with details of suffering that seem almost impossible to believe. Yet many of these testimonies are ignored or dismissed, either because they are too terrible to accept, or because post-war Germany is not ready to confront the full horror of what its soldiers experienced. It will take decades before Stalingrad is properly understood, before the full scope of the battle and its aftermath becomes clear. The suffering of the German soldiers at Stalingrad is well documented, extensively studied, the subject of countless books and films and scholarly works. Less well known, often forgotten, is the suffering of the Soviet soldiers who fought in the same battle, who died in even greater numbers, who endured conditions just as terrible, and in some ways worse. The Soviet Union lost approximately 1.1 million men at Stalingrad, killed, wounded, or captured. This number is so large as to be almost incomprehensible. It is more than the entire population of some countries. It is more than all American casualties in all of World War II combined. And these deaths occurred in a single battle, in a single city, over the course of 5 months. The Soviet soldiers who fought at Stalingrad faced many of the same horrors as their German counterparts. They endured the same cold, the same hunger, the same constant danger of death from bullets or shells or collapsing buildings. They fought in the same ruins, breathed the same smoke-filled air, walked over the same piles of corpses. In some ways their situation was worse. Soviet logistics were even more chaotic than German logistics. Soviet soldiers often went into battle with inadequate weapons, sometimes no weapons at all. The famous blocking detachments behind Soviet lines shot their own men for retreating, creating a situation where Soviet soldiers faced death whether they advanced or fell back. The Soviet wounded received even worse care than the German wounded, if such a thing is possible. Soviet medical services were primitive, understaffed, undersupplied. Wounded men often lay on the battlefield for days before being evacuated, if they were evacuated at all. Amputations were performed without anesthesia, as a matter of course, not because anesthesia was unavailable in principle, but because it was unavailable in practice, never reaching the front lines where it was needed. Infection rates were astronomical. Many Soviet soldiers who survived their initial wounds died days or weeks later, from gangrene or sepsis, or simple neglect. The Soviet soldiers who survived the battle received no parades, no celebrations, no recognition of their sacrifice. They were expected to continue fighting, to move on to the next battle, to keep giving everything they had until the war was won or they were dead. Those who were wounded too severely to continue fighting were often abandoned, left to fend for themselves with minimal pensions and no support services. Those who were captured by the Germans and later liberated faced suspicion and persecution, accused of treason for allowing themselves to be taken prisoner, sent to prison camps or executed for the crime of having survived when they should have died. The Soviet Union, unlike Germany, did not immediately confront the full horror of what happened at Stalingrad. The battle was celebrated as a great victory, which it was militarily, but the cost of that victory was minimized or ignored entirely. The casualty figures were classified, not released to the public for decades. The suffering of individual soldiers was subsumed into the collective narrative of Soviet heroism and sacrifice. It was not until the 1990s, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, that the full truth about Soviet casualties and conditions began to emerge, and even now, much remains unknown or disputed. The Soviet survivors of Stalingrad carried their trauma silently, unable to speak openly about their experiences in a society that demanded only triumphant narratives, that had no room for stories of suffering or defeat or moral ambiguity. Many drank heavily, like their German counterparts, trying to forget what could not be forgotten. Others threw themselves into work, into building the new Soviet society, channeling their trauma into productivity. Still others simply endured, living with their memories and their wounds and their nightmares, waiting for death to release them from the burden of survival. Stalingrad itself, the city that gave its name to the battle, was completely destroyed. Not a single building remained intact. The population, which had numbered 400,000 before the battle, was reduced to fewer than 10,000, most of them living in cellars and ruins, scrounging for food among the rubble. The city was a wasteland, a field of broken concrete and twisted metal stretching for miles along the Volga, inhabited by ghosts and rats and the stench of death that would not dissipate for years. The Soviet government made the decision to rebuild Stalingrad, not just to restore it, but to make it a showcase, a symbol of Soviet resilience and strength. The reconstruction began almost immediately after the battle ended, even while the ground was still frozen, even while unexploded ordnance and corpses still littered the streets. Workers were brought in from across the Soviet Union, conscripted labor and volunteers, to clear the rubble, to begin the slow process of rebuilding a city from nothing. The reconstruction took decades. The rubble had to be cleared, millions of tons of it, sorted and hauled away or crushed and used as fill. Unexploded bombs and shells had to be located and defused or detonated, a dangerous task that killed many of the workers who undertook it. Bodies had to be found and buried, though many were simply bulldozed into mass graves, or left where they lay, built over and forgotten. The ground itself was contaminated with metal fragments and chemical residue from explosives, making construction difficult and dangerous. The new Stalingrad that rose from the ruins was designed to be a monument to the battle and to Soviet power. Wide boulevards replaced the narrow streets of the old city. Massive apartment blocks replaced the wooden houses and small factories. The centerpiece of the new city was the memorial complex on Mamayev Kurgan, where a giant statue called the Motherland Calls was erected, a sword-wielding woman 85 meters tall, visible from every part of the city. The memorial became one of the most visited sites in the Soviet Union, a pilgrimage destination for veterans and their families, a place to remember the dead and to celebrate the victory. But beneath the monuments and the new construction, beneath the official narrative of heroism and triumph, the old Stalingrad remained. Workers digging foundations would unearth skulls and bones and rusted weapons. Children playing in vacant lots would find grenades and bullets and shell fragments. The earth itself was a cemetery, holding the remains of tens of thousands who were never properly buried, who died anonymous deaths and were lost to history. Even today, more than 80 years after the battle, construction workers in Volgograd, as the city was renamed after Stalin's death, regularly discover human remains, reminders that the dead of Stalingrad are still with us, still waiting to be found and honored. The Battle of Stalingrad changed the course of World War II, and arguably the course of human history. It was the first major defeat of the German Wehrmacht, the first clear demonstration that the Nazi war machine could be stopped and destroyed. It shifted the momentum of the war irreversibly in favor of the Allies, began the long retreat of German forces that would end in Berlin in 1945. It cost Germany an entire army, losses that could never be replaced, that permanently weakened the Wehrmacht and made ultimate German defeat inevitable. But the battle's significance extends far beyond its military consequences. Stalingrad became a symbol, perhaps the symbol of the brutality and horror of modern industrial warfare. It demonstrated that technology and ideology combined with human determination or human madness could create conditions of suffering previously unimaginable. It showed that civilization is far more fragile than we like to believe, that given the right circumstances, human beings can be reduced to animals fighting over scraps of food in ruins, that the veneer of culture and morality is thin indeed. The battle also demonstrated the incredible capacity of human beings to endure suffering, to continue functioning under conditions that should be absolutely unbearable. The soldiers who fought at Stalingrad, on both sides, experienced things that should have broken them, should have destroyed their minds and bodies and souls. Yet many survived, not just physically but mentally, maintained their humanity despite everything, emerged from hell still recognizably human even if forever changed. This resilience is perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the battle, more remarkable even than the strategic outcome or the casualty figures. Stalingrad has become the subject of countless books, films, documentaries, academic studies. It is taught in military academies around the world as a case study in urban warfare, in logistics, in the importance of morale and leadership. It is analyzed by historians trying to understand how such a catastrophe could occur, how two nations could commit such resources to the destruction of a single city, how so many could die for such unclear strategic gains. It is remembered by veterans and their descendants, by Russians as a great patriotic victory, by Germans as a terrible tragedy, by both as a defining moment in their national histories. In the chaos and brutality of Stalingrad, where armies measured advances in meters and victories in single buildings captured, a different kind of warfare emerged from the rubble. This was the domain of the snipers, patient hunters who could kill from concealment, who turned the ruined city into their personal hunting ground, who achieved a kind of dark fame that would outlast the battle itself. The sniper war in Stalingrad was not just a military tactic but a psychological weapon, a way to terrorize the enemy, to make every movement potentially fatal, to create a pervasive atmosphere of dread that sapped morale as effectively as bullets killed bodies. The Soviet military embraced sniper warfare with particular enthusiasm, recognizing that in the close confines of urban combat, a skilled marksman could be worth a dozen ordinary soldiers. They established sniper schools, recruited hunters and target shooters from across the Soviet Union, trained them in the specific techniques needed for urban warfare. These were not the long-range precision shooters of open warfare, taking shots at targets hundreds of meters away. These were close-quarters hunters, operating at ranges of 50 to 200 meters, shooting through windows and doorways, between piles of rubble, across streets and courtyards where the enemy believed they were safe. The most famous of these Soviet snipers was Vasily Zaitsev, a shepherd from the Urals who had learned to shoot hunting deer in the mountains before the war. Zaitsev arrived in Stalingrad in September 1942 and quickly distinguished himself as a natural sniper, patient and methodical, with an almost supernatural ability to read terrain and anticipate enemy movements. Soviet propaganda seized on Zaitsev, made him a hero, reported his kill count in newspapers and on radio broadcasts. The numbers grew with each report, 50 kills, 100, eventually over 200, though historians debate whether these figures are accurate or inflated for propaganda purposes. What is not disputed is that Zaitsev and the other Soviet snipers had a profound psychological impact on German morale. German soldiers became terrified of exposing themselves, developed elaborate precautions and rituals to avoid becoming targets. They would watch a street or courtyard for hours before attempting to cross it, looking for any sign of a sniper's position. They learned to move in sudden unpredictable bursts, never in straight lines, never at regular intervals. They communicated in whispers, even when separated by substantial distances, fearing that a sniper might be close enough to hear and locate them by sound. The snipers developed techniques specific to the urban environment of Stalingrad. They would fire from deep inside buildings, positioning themselves well back from windows so that muzzle flash and smoke would not reveal their location. They would shoot through small holes knocked in walls, through gaps in rubble piles, from positions that offered concealment from multiple angles. They learned to change positions frequently, never firing more than a few shots from any single location before moving. They became masters of camouflage, draping themselves in material that matched the rubble around them, remaining motionless for hours, sometimes days, waiting for the perfect shot. The German military initially struggled to counter the Soviet snipers. German soldiers were trained for open warfare, for rapid advances supported by armor and artillery, not for the patient stalking required in urban combat. But they adapted, as professional soldiers do, bringing in their own expert marksmen, hunters and gamekeepers from Bavaria and Prussia, men who understood patience and concealment. These German snipers were often equipped with better rifles than their Soviet counterparts, precision weapons with telescopic sights of high quality, but equipment alone could not overcome the Soviet advantages in numbers and familiarity with the terrain. The sniper war became intensely personal in a way that other aspects of the battle were not. Artillery bombardment is impersonal, random death from the sky. Infantry assaults are chaotic, confused, too fast-moving for individual enmities to develop. But sniping is intimate. The sniper chooses his target, studies him, waits for the right moment, then kills him with deliberation and precision. And because snipers often operated in the same areas for weeks, they came to recognize each other's work, to identify individual enemy snipers by their techniques and patterns. Vasily Zaitsev became locked in a famous duel with a German sniper, who may have been named Heinz Thorvald, though historians debate whether this man existed, or was a propaganda invention. According to the story, Thorvald was a master sniper sent specifically to kill Zaitsev, to eliminate the Soviet hero whose exploits were damaging German morale. The two hunters stalked each other through the ruins for days, each trying to anticipate the other's position, each setting traps and ambushes. Finally, according to Soviet accounts, Zaitsev identified Thorvald's position and killed him with a single shot. The story may be true, or partly true, or entirely fabricated. What matters is that soldiers on both sides believed it, that the sniper duel became legendary, that it demonstrated the personal, almost intimate nature of the sniper war. The life of a sniper in Stalingrad was one of extreme stress punctuated by moments of intense action. A sniper might spend days in the same position, barely moving, barely sleeping, eating cold food because cooking would reveal his location, urinating and defecating, where he lay because leaving his position might mean death. He would watch enemy positions through his scope for hours, learning patterns, identifying targets, waiting for someone to make a mistake. Then, when the moment came, he would fire a single shot, watch the target fall, and immediately begin planning his next move, because the shot had revealed his position, and counter-snipers would be searching for him. The psychological toll of this work was enormous. Unlike other soldiers who could lose themselves in the chaos of combat, who could act without thinking in the heat of battle, snipers had to remain calm and deliberate. They had to watch their targets as individuals, to see their faces, to observe their habits and personalities, and then to kill them cold-bloodedly. Some snipers came to view their work as a kind of hunting, no different from shooting deer or wolves, a way to distance themselves emotionally from the act of killing. Others struggled with the moral weight of what they were doing, with the knowledge that they were assassins, not soldiers in conventional combat. Soviet sniper doctrine emphasized teamwork, with snipers often working in pairs, a shooter and a spotter. The spotter would use binoculars to scan for targets and watch for enemy counter-snipers, while the shooter remained focused on his scope and his shot. This division of labor made both men more effective and safer, providing redundancy and additional perspective. The spotter could watch the shooter's blind spots, could identify threats the shooter might miss while concentrating on a target. The two men would often work together for months, developing an almost telepathic communication, understanding each other's thoughts and intentions with minimal verbal exchange. The Germans eventually developed their own sniper teams and tactics, creating specialized units trained specifically for urban warfare. These Scharfschützen became increasingly effective as the battle progressed, achieving kill ratios comparable to their Soviet counterparts. But they never quite matched the Soviet success in using snipers as a psychological weapon, in creating the pervasive atmosphere of dread that made German soldiers terrified to move, terrified to expose themselves even for essential tasks. As the battle ground on through October and November, the fighting evolved into what Soviet soldiers called the Rattenkrieg, the War of the Rats. This was combat stripped to its most primitive essence, fighting at such close quarters that grenades were more useful than rifles, that entrenching tools became weapons, that men grappled hand-to-hand in the darkness of basements and sewers. The battle moved underground, into the cellars and tunnels and drainage systems beneath Stalingrad, into a subterranean world where conventional military tactics had no meaning. Both armies discovered that controlling a building meant controlling not just the floors above ground, but the spaces below. Basements provided shelter from artillery and air attacks, offered concealment and protection, served as staging areas for assaults, and as refuges when attacks failed. But basements were also death traps, vulnerable to flooding or fire, easy to seal and turn into tombs for the men inside. The fighting for control of these underground spaces was some of the most vicious of the entire battle. Small assault groups, typically 5 to 10 men, would infiltrate enemy-held buildings through the sewers, or by blasting through basement walls. They would move through the darkness with knives and grenades and submachine guns, killing quietly when possible, creating chaos when stealth failed. The fighting in these conditions was disorienting and terrifying. Men could not see more than a few meters, often could not see at all, navigating by sound and touch, firing at muzzle flashes, throwing grenades blindly into rooms they hoped contained enemies and not their own comrades. The Germans initially struggled with this kind of combat. Their doctrine emphasized firepower and combined arms, tanks and artillery supporting infantry advances. But underground tanks were useless, and artillery could not help without risking killing one's own troops. The Germans had to adapt, had to learn to fight Soviet style, with small groups operating independently, using improvised tactics, accepting casualties that would have been unacceptable in conventional warfare. Some German units adapted successfully, developing their own assault groups and underground infiltration tactics. Others never adjusted, continued trying to fight by doctrine in situations where doctrine meant death. The Soviets had advantages in this underground war. Soviet soldiers were often workers from factories or farms, accustomed to confined spaces and physical labor, comfortable in environments that terrified middle-class German conscripts. Soviet commanders encouraged initiative and independence in these assault groups, gave them objectives but allowed them to determine their own methods. And Soviet soldiers were defending their own country, fighting in ruins that had been their homes or workplaces, familiar with the terrain in ways the Germans could never match. The fighting in the sewers was particularly nightmarish. The sewers of Stalingrad formed a network of tunnels connecting different parts of the city, offering covered routes of movement invisible to enemy observation. Both sides used these tunnels to infiltrate enemy positions, to move supplies and reinforcements, to evacuate wounded. But the sewers were also hazardous, dark and slippery and prone to flooding, filled with sewage and the corpses of men who had died there and been left because retrieving bodies from the sewers was too dangerous. Men who fought in the sewers described an experience beyond normal combat, a descent into a kind of hell that made even the surface fighting seem tolerable by comparison. The darkness was absolute, penetrated only by occasional flashlights that made excellent targets for anyone watching. The air was foul, thick with the stench of sewage and death, barely breathable. The water was contaminated, carrying disease, but men had to wade through it, sometimes swim through it, to reach their objectives. And the fighting, when it came, was at point-blank range, men shooting at sounds or shadows, killing and dying in darkness, never knowing if they had killed enemies or friends until they found the bodies. Both sides laid traps in the sewers, mines and tripwires and deadfalls designed to kill or maim anyone passing through. They poisoned sections of tunnel, pumped in gas or smoke, flooded chambers to drown men sheltering there. They collapsed tunnels on enemy positions, buried them alive. The sewers became a parallel battlefield, as important as the surface fighting, with its own tactics and its own horrors that those who experienced them rarely spoke about afterward. In November, even as the Soviet encirclement was closing around the Sixth Army, the Germans launched a final series of desperate offensives aimed at capturing the remaining Soviet positions along the Volga. These attacks were launched with the last reserves of strength the Sixth Army possessed, with units that had been ground down to fractions of their original strength, with men who were already exhausted and malnourished and operating on willpower alone. The focus of these attacks was the industrial district, the factories that the Soviets still held, the last significant positions between the Germans and complete control of the city. The Germans threw everything they had at these positions: infantry, tanks, artillery, combat engineers with flamethrowers and demolition charges. They attacked again and again, wave after wave, achieving small gains measured in meters, capturing individual workshops or sections of assembly line, then being thrown back by Soviet counterattacks. The fighting in the factories reached an intensity that exceeded even the terrible combat of previous months. Single rooms changed hands multiple times in a day. Men fought hand-to-hand with bayonets and knives and fists when ammunition ran out. The factories became mazes of death, every corridor a potential ambush, every doorway a fatal funnel, every piece of machinery both cover and obstacle. The Germans would blast through a wall to enter a workshop, only to face Soviet soldiers dug in behind heavy equipment, firing from concealment, picking off attackers one by one. The Barricady gun factory was the scene of some of the most savage fighting. This massive complex, covering dozens of acres, producing artillery pieces and other weapons, became a fortress within a fortress. The Soviets fortified it elaborately, turning every workshop into a strong point, every hallway into a killing zone. The Germans attacked with a full division, thousands of men supported by dozens of tanks, and gained only a few hundred meters in days of continuous combat. The cost was astronomical. Entire companies were destroyed. Battalions ceased to exist. The division was ground down to battalion strength, and still the attacks continued. One German soldier, a veteran of campaigns in Poland and France, described the factory fighting in his diary. "This is not war, as we knew it. This is mutual extermination. We attack a room and kill everyone in it. Then Soviet soldiers appear from nowhere and kill everyone we just sent in. We retake the room and find our own dead mixed with theirs. The next day we attack the same room again, because the Soviets have reoccupied it overnight. This goes on day after day. I do not think anyone will survive this. I do not think survival is possible. We are all dead men. We just have not stopped moving yet." The Soviet defenders were equally exhausted, equally desperate. They had been fighting for months with minimal supplies, minimal food, minimal rest. They held their positions not because they believed in ultimate victory, not because they saw a path to survival, but because they had been ordered to hold, because retreat meant execution, because they literally had nowhere to go. Behind them was the Volga, and beyond the Volga was nothing but more war, more fighting, more death. At least here they knew the terrain, had fortified positions, had comrades beside them. The German offensives finally ground to a halt in mid-November, not because they had achieved their objectives, but because the units involved had simply ceased to exist as effective fighting forces. Companies were reduced to a dozen men. Battalions had the strength of platoons. The survivors were too exhausted to continue attacking. could barely maintain the positions they held. And then the Soviet counteroffensive struck, and everything changed. When news of the encirclement reached the German soldiers fighting in the factories, the effect on morale was catastrophic. Men who had believed they were winning, that victory was just one more push away, suddenly understood that they were trapped, that all their sacrifice had been meaningless, that they would not be leaving Stalingrad, except as corpses or prisoners. Some units continued fighting out of discipline or habit, or simple inability to process the new reality. Others simply stopped, sat down in their positions, waited for orders that would never come, or for death that would come soon enough. While the Sixth Army slowly starved and froze in the Stalingrad pocket, the German High Command organized desperate attempts to break through the Soviet encirclement and rescue the trapped soldiers. The most significant of these was Operation Winter Storm, launched in mid-December under the command of Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, one of Germany's most capable commanders. Manstein assembled a relief force centered on the 4th Panzer Army, including some of the Wehrmacht's best divisions, and drove towards Stalingrad from the southwest. The plan was for Manstein's forces to break through the Soviet lines and create a corridor to Stalingrad, through which supplies could be sent, and if necessary, through which the Sixth Army could evacuate. But the plan required Paulus and the Sixth Army to break out simultaneously, to fight their way toward the relief force and link up. Hitler had forbidden any breakout attempt, had ordered the Sixth Army to hold Stalingrad regardless of circumstances, but Manstein hoped that once his forces got close enough, operational necessity would override Hitler's orders. The relief attempt came agonizingly close to success. Manstein's panzers smashed through Soviet defensive lines, advanced to within 30 miles of the pocket, close enough that the German soldiers in Stalingrad could see the flashes of artillery from the relief force on the horizon, close enough that they could hear the distant rumble of tank battles. The trapped soldiers prepared for breakout, assembled what vehicles still functioned, organized their weakest men for evacuation, waited for the order to move, but the order never came. Paulus, bound by his oath of obedience to Hitler, refused to act without explicit authorization to break out. He reported the situation to Hitler, requested permission to link up with Manstein's forces. Hitler refused, ordered the Sixth Army to maintain its positions, insisted that the Luftwaffe would supply the pocket, that another relief attempt would be organized if this one failed. Paulus, the perfect staff officer who had spent his career following orders without question, obeyed. The Sixth Army remained in place while the opportunity for salvation slipped away. Meanwhile, the Soviets recognized the threat posed by Manstein's advance and redirected substantial forces to stop him. Fresh Soviet armies, held in reserve specifically for this contingency, were thrown against the relief force. The fighting was brutal, tank battles across the frozen steppe, both sides taking massive casualties. Manstein's advance slowed, then stopped, then began to retreat as Soviet pressure became overwhelming. By Christmas, the relief attempt had failed. The Sixth Army would not be rescued, the corridor would not be opened. The soldiers trapped in Stalingrad were on their own, abandoned by their Führer to whatever fate awaited them. The psychological impact of the failed relief attempt on the trapped soldiers was crushing. They had seen salvation within reach, had prepared to escape, had allowed themselves to hope. Now that hope was extinguished, they understood that no one was coming for them, that the promises of supply by air were lies or delusions, that they had been left to die. Some men broke completely, refused to continue fighting, had to be threatened or shot by their officers to maintain discipline. Others accepted their fate with a kind of fatalism, continued performing their duties mechanically, going through the motions because there was nothing else to do. The German soldiers trapped in the pocket celebrated Christmas 1942 in the most miserable conditions imaginable. There were no decorations, no trees, no presents, no special food. Some units held brief religious services, officers or chaplains, reading from the Bible, or leading prayers, but these were somber affairs with none of the joy normally associated with the holiday. Men thought of their families at home, imagined Christmas celebrations happening without them, wondered if they would ever see another Christmas. Many wrote final letters, knowing the letters would probably never be delivered, but needing to say goodbye, needing to leave some record that they had existed, that they had loved and been loved. The Luftwaffe's supply effort, which had been inadequate from the beginning, became even more pathetic as winter weather worsened. Snowstorms and fog grounded aircraft for days at a time. Soviet fighters, operating from nearby airfields, shot down transport planes in increasing numbers. The Germans lost hundreds of aircraft attempting to supply the pocket, along with their crews, experienced pilots and navigators, who could not be replaced. The tonnage of supplies delivered never approached the minimum needed to sustain the Sixth Army. On a good day, perhaps 100 tons reached the pocket, less than a quarter of what was needed. On most days, far less arrived. On many days, nothing arrived at all. The supplies that did reach the pocket were often inappropriate or useless. Aircraft would arrive carrying ammunition when food was desperately needed, or food when ammunition had run out, or winter clothing in sizes that fit no one, or spare parts for equipment that had long since been destroyed. The lack of coordination revealed the complete breakdown of German logistics, the inability of the High Command to understand the situation on the ground, the widening gap between the promises made from comfortable headquarters and the reality experienced by freezing, starving soldiers. Within the pocket, a brutal hierarchy of survival developed. Not all German soldiers suffered equally. Those with access to resources, with connections or rank or simple luck, ate better, stayed warmer, had better chances of surviving than their less fortunate comrades. This stratification created resentment, and sometimes open conflict, destroying unit cohesion and morale, even as it allowed some to survive a few days or weeks longer. Officers generally fared better than enlisted men, at least initially. They had access to the limited supply that arrived by air, could requisition what little food existed, had better shelters and warmer clothing. Some officers shared their advantages with their men, maintained unit cohesion by distributing resources fairly. Others hoarded what they had, looked after themselves and their favorites, let the rest starve. The German army, which prided itself on discipline and esprit de corps, began to fracture along lines of class and privilege that had always existed, but had been masked by victory and adequate supplies. Certain specialized units received preferential treatment. Tank crews, though their vehicles were increasingly useless due to lack of fuel and spare parts, were still considered valuable and received better rations. Headquarters staff, working in relatively warm bunkers, ate better than frontline infantry freezing in ruins. Medical personnel, aircraft crews, anyone performing functions deemed essential by higher command, received advantages that ordinary soldiers did not. The ordinary infantry, the man in the front line, the one actually fighting and dying, received the least and suffered the most. Some soldiers turned to theft and black market activities to survive. They stole from supply depots, from each other, from the dead. They traded cigarettes and alcohol for food, personal possessions for warmth. A functioning watch might buy a piece of bread. A photograph from home might be traded for a cup of soup. Men sold everything they owned, everything that was not immediately necessary for survival, and then sold things that were necessary, betting that they would find another way to survive, that something would change before the consequences caught up with them. The most desperate turned to preying on their comrades. There were reports of soldiers killed for their food rations, of wounded men robbed as they lay helpless, of the dead stripped of everything valuable before their bodies were cold. These reports were suppressed by German authorities, denied as Soviet propaganda, but the soldiers in the pocket knew better. They had seen the evidence, had witnessed the breakdown of civilized behavior, had perhaps participated in it themselves because the alternative was death. The hierarchy of suffering extended to different nationalities within the pocket. The Sixth Army included not just Germans but also Romanian, Italian and Croatian units, Allied forces fighting alongside the Wehrmacht. These non-German soldiers generally received the worst treatment, were given the most dangerous assignments, received the smallest rations, were considered expendable by German commanders, who prioritized their own countrymen. Many of these Allied soldiers died not in combat, but from neglect, abandoned by German officers who saw them as foreigners, as burdens, as lives less valuable than German lives. The Soviet attacks that resumed after the encirclement often targeted these non-German units, recognizing them as weak points in the German defenses. The Romanian and Italian soldiers, poorly equipped and poorly led, frequently broke under attack, creating gaps that Soviet forces exploited. This led to further resentment from German commanders, who blamed their allies for defeats while ignoring the fact that these allies had been given inadequate support and impossible tasks. The relations between German and Allied forces deteriorated to the point of open hostility, with some German units refusing to coordinate with Allied units, leaving them to fend for themselves. The new year brought no hope to the soldiers trapped in Stalingrad. January 1943 was the coldest month of the winter, with temperatures regularly dropping below -30°C. The supplies that had been inadequate in December became almost non-existent in January. The Luftwaffe, having lost too many aircraft in previous supply attempts, scaled back operations. The pocket was divided by Soviet advances into two separate zones that could no longer support each other. The end was approaching, visible to everyone, inevitable, yet the suffering continued because surrender was forbidden and death was slow. The Soviet forces, sensing final victory, prepared for the kill. They massed artillery around the pocket, brought in fresh divisions, organized a systematic reduction of the remaining German positions. On January 10th, they delivered an ultimatum to Polis: surrender or be destroyed. The ultimatum promised humane treatment for prisoners, medical care for the wounded, retention of personal possessions. It was a generous offer given the circumstances, likely the best terms the Germans could hope for. Polis forwarded the ultimatum to Hitler, requesting permission to accept. Hitler's response was predictable: refuse the offer, continue fighting to the last man, trust that a new relief attempt was being organized. Polis, still obedient, rejected the Soviet ultimatum. The Soviets responded with an artillery barrage of unprecedented intensity, thousands of guns firing simultaneously, reducing what remained of German positions to rubble and dust. Then came the infantry and tanks, rolling over the shattered defenses, crushing what little resistance the Germans could still offer. The final Soviet offensive destroyed the last organized German resistance within days. Units that had fought together for months were scattered, broken into small groups that could no longer communicate with each other or with higher command. The chain of command disintegrated. Soldiers no longer knew who their officers were or what their orders might be. They fought from isolated positions, small groups making last stands in cellars and ruins, selling their lives for a few more hours or a few more meters of rubble. The two pockets, northern and southern, were reduced day by day. The northern pocket, containing the factory district, where some of the worst fighting of the entire battle had occurred, was the first to collapse. The soldiers there, weak from months of combat and starvation, could barely offer resistance. Many simply waited in their positions for the Soviets to arrive, too weak to fight, too exhausted to care any more about their fate. The southern pocket lasted a few days longer, but its end was equally inevitable. The scenes as the pocket collapsed were apocalyptic. Thousands of wounded, abandoned as field hospitals were overrun, lay in the ruins crying for help that would not come. Supply dumps were looted by starving soldiers, who consumed anything remotely edible, then collapsed from eating food their systems could no longer process. Officers burned documents and destroyed equipment, following protocols that seemed absurd, given the circumstances, but providing structure and purpose in a world that had lost all meaning. Some soldiers attempted to escape, to break through Soviet lines and flee east across the Volga, hoping to somehow reach German lines hundreds of kilometers away. These attempts were suicidal. The men were too weak to travel far, had no food or supplies, faced Soviet patrols and hostile civilians and winter weather that killed as efficiently as bullets. Almost all were captured or died within hours or days of leaving the pocket. The frozen steppe around Stalingrad became littered with German corpses, men who had survived months of combat only to die alone in the snow, frozen solid in the positions where they fell. On January 31, 1943, Hitler promoted Polis to Field Marshal, the youngest in the German army. The promotion was intended to encourage Polis to commit suicide rather than surrender, as no German field marshal had ever been captured alive. Hitler believed that the shame of surrender would be unbearable for a man of Polis's background and training, that Polis would choose death over dishonor, but Hitler misjudged his man. Polis, having followed orders without question for months while his army was destroyed around him, finally chose to disobey. He refused to kill himself. He chose captivity over suicide, life over death, even if that life meant imprisonment and disgrace. The surrender was not immediate or complete. Polis surrendered himself and his immediate staff, along with the southern pocket, but the northern pocket, cut off and unable to communicate, continued fighting for 2 more days. On February 2nd, the last German units in Stalingrad finally laid down their weapons. The battle was over. The city had been defended. The invaders had been defeated. The cost had been beyond comprehension. The German prisoners were formed into columns and marched away from Stalingrad. Soviet soldiers, many of them barely more healthy than their captives, watched impassively as the remnants of the Sixth Army shuffled past. These were the men who had terrorized the Soviet Union for 2 years, who had advanced to the gates of Moscow, who had seemed unstoppable. Now they were broken, hollow-eyed scarecrows barely recognizable as human beings, let alone as soldiers. Some Soviet soldiers felt pity for them. Others felt satisfaction, seeing their enemies reduced to this state. Most felt nothing, too exhausted and traumatized themselves to spare emotion for anyone else's suffering. The march into captivity began immediately, and with it began a new chapter of suffering for the survivors. They would march for weeks through the frozen steppe, would be packed into unheated transit camps, would work as slave laborers in mines and factories across the Soviet Union. Most would die in captivity. Only a handful would ever see Germany again. But in that moment, as they stumbled away from the ruins of Stalingrad, they were simply relieved to be alive, to have survived, to have reached the end of a nightmare that had lasted 5 months and had destroyed an army, and a city, and the lives of everyone who experienced it. The Soviet soldiers who had defended Stalingrad were equally exhausted, equally traumatized. They had won a great victory, had stopped the German advance, had destroyed an entire German army, but they had paid a terrible price, had lost comrades and friends, had endured conditions as bad as anything the Germans experienced, had seen things that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. There was celebration, but it was muted. Men were too tired for joy, too broken for triumph. They had survived, but survival felt less like victory, and more like simply continuing to exist in a world that had become unrecognizable. Now, having traveled through every circle of this frozen hell, having witnessed the complete horror of what Stalingrad was, we must return to the question that began this journey. Why would you not survive a night in the Battle of Stalingrad? The answer, after everything we have seen, should be devastatingly clear. But let us be explicit. Let us catalogue the specific ways that this battle would kill you. An ordinary person from the modern world, someone used to safety and comfort, and the assumption that tomorrow will come. The first and most obvious answer is that you would die from enemy action. The Battle of Stalingrad produced casualties at a rate that is difficult to comprehend from our safe distance. On an average day during the height of the fighting, thousands of men died. Not metaphorically, not approximately, literally thousands of individual human beings ceased to exist every single day for months. The probability of any individual surviving this meat grinder for any extended period was vanishingly small. Soldiers who had training, who had experience, who knew how to fight and survive, died in droves. You, with no military training, no combat experience, no understanding of how to read a battlefield or anticipate danger, would have the life expectancy of a mayfly. The ways you might die in combat are numerous and varied. A bullet might find you, perhaps aimed at you specifically by a sniper who has been watching your position, perhaps a stray round from a machine gun firing blindly into the ruins, perhaps a ricochet that bounces off rubble and strikes you when you thought you were safe behind cover. A shell fragment might tear through your body, a piece of hot metal traveling at supersonic speed, shredding flesh and shattering bone, causing wounds that no medical care in Stalingrad could treat. A building might collapse on you during a bombardment, tons of concrete and steel burying you alive, crushing you instantly or trapping you to die slowly from your injuries or from suffocation. But let us say, for the sake of argument, that you somehow survive your first combat engagement. Let us say you are lucky, that you find good cover, that the enemy's aim is poor, that you make it through the first day alive. You still face the cold, and the cold in Stalingrad in winter is not the cold of a brisk autumn day, or even of a harsh winter in a temperate climate. This is cold that kills, that attacks your body relentlessly, that requires constant vigilance and effort to survive. Modern humans, especially those from developed countries, have almost no experience with genuine survival cold. You live in heated homes, drive heated cars, wear coats designed by engineers to maximize warmth. If you get cold, you go inside, you turn up the thermostat, you make hot chocolate and wrap yourself in blankets. You have never experienced cold as a constant threat, as an enemy that never sleeps, that attacks you every moment of every day, that will kill you if you give it the slightest opportunity. In Stalingrad, there is no escape from the cold. The buildings offer minimal shelter, their walls broken, their roofs gone, wind howling through them as freely as across the open steppe. There is no heat beyond what you can create yourself, and fuel is scarce, precious, guarded jealously by men who will fight you for it. The clothing you have, assuming you have the winter clothing that Soviet soldiers possessed, is adequate, but only if you remain active, only if you keep moving to generate body heat. But combat requires periods of stillness, of lying in wait, of remaining motionless in an observation post or ambush position. During these periods, the cold penetrates everything, seeps through every layer of clothing, attacks your core temperature degree by degree. You would develop frostbite within hours of exposure. Your fingers and toes, your nose and ears, the extremities where blood flow is most easily compromised, would turn white as circulation fails, then red and painful as ice crystals form in your tissues, then black as the flesh dies. If you are lucky, you lose only the tips of your fingers, maybe a toe or two. If you are unlucky, you lose entire hands or feet, amputated by medics with no anesthesia, leaving you crippled for life assuming you survive the procedure. Hypothermia would follow frostbite. As your body loses heat faster than it can generate it, your core temperature begins to drop. First you shiver, your body's attempt to generate warmth through muscle activity. Then the shivering becomes violent, uncontrollable, exhausting. Your thinking becomes confused, muddled. You make poor decisions, forget important things. Then the shivering stops, which seems like relief, but is actually a sign that you are dying. Your heart rate slows, your breathing becomes shallow. You feel warm, paradoxically warm, and the urge to remove your clothes becomes overwhelming. Some hypothermia victims are found naked, having stripped off their protective layers in the delirium of approaching death. Finally, you simply stop, your body's systems shutting down one by one, consciousness fading into darkness, death coming quietly in the cold. But again, let us say you somehow avoid freezing to death. You stay active, you find adequate shelter, you manage to maintain your body temperature. You still face starvation, and starvation in Stalingrad is not the gradual extended process of a famine. It is acute, rapid, made worse by the cold and the physical demands of combat. Your body requires thousands of calories per day to function in these conditions, to maintain warmth, to provide energy for combat, simply to stay alive. The rations available, especially in the German pocket, but even for Soviet soldiers, provide a fraction of what you need. Modern humans, especially in wealthy countries, have no experience with real hunger. You might skip a meal occasionally, might feel hungry between breakfast and lunch, might diet to lose weight, but you have never experienced genuine starvation. The process of your body consuming itself because no food is available, the sensation of your stomach cramping in on itself, the weakness that makes climbing stairs feel like scaling a mountain, the obsessive thoughts about food that crowd out everything else. In Stalingrad, you would watch yourself waste away. The fat disappears first, your body burning its reserves, then the muscle goes, broken down for energy, leaving you weak and shaky. Your face becomes skeletal, skin stretched tight over bones, eyes sunken deep in their sockets, your hair falls out. Your gums bleed, old wounds reopen as your body lacks the resources to maintain healed tissue. Your immune system fails, leaving you vulnerable to every disease and infection. You become cold all the time because your body cannot generate heat without fuel. Your thinking slows, becomes foggy, you forget things, cannot concentrate, make mistakes that in combat mean death, and the hunger itself, the physical sensation of starvation, is excruciating. Your stomach produces acid with nothing to digest, burning your insides. The hunger cramps are agonizing, doubling you over, making you want to eat anything, everything, even things you know are not food. Men in Stalingrad ate leather, boiled into a glutinous mass that provided minimal nutrition but at least filled the stomach temporarily. They ate paste scraped from walls, they ate grass and bark, and anything else that could be forced down. Some, as we have discussed, ate human flesh, though whether this happened is disputed and unprovable. But whether it happened or not, the fact that it was whispered about, that it was considered possible, tells you everything you need to know about the depths to which starvation reduces human beings. You would die from disease, probably, even if you survived combat, and cold and hunger. The conditions in Stalingrad are perfect for disease transmission: crowded quarters, no sanitation, contaminated water, no hygiene, no medical care, bodies weakened by malnutrition and stress. Typhus spreads through lice that infest every soldier, every piece of clothing, every blanket and shelter. The disease causes fever, delirium, a rash that covers the body, death in a substantial percentage of cases, dysentery, caused by bacteria in contaminated food and water, causes diarrhea so severe that victims die from dehydration within days. Pneumonia, attacks lungs weakened by cold and exhaustion, filling them with fluid, drowning victims in their own bodily secretions. Modern humans rely on antibiotics and vaccines, and modern medicine to protect us from diseases that once killed millions. You have been vaccinated against many diseases, have access to antibiotics if you get an infection, can see a doctor if you develop symptoms. In Stalingrad, you have none of these protections. A simple infected cut can turn septic, can poison your blood, can kill you within days. A case of pneumonia, easily treated in a modern hospital, becomes a death sentence. Dysentery, an unpleasant but manageable illness with proper treatment, kills you through dehydration and exhaustion. And even if you somehow avoid all of these physical threats, even if you are lucky or skilled or tough enough to survive the bullets and the cold and the hunger and the disease, you would still face the psychological destruction that Stalingrad inflicts on everyone who experiences it. The human mind is not designed to endure this level of stress, this intensity of horror, this constant exposure to death and suffering. You are not trained to compartmentalize trauma, to function while terrified, to remain sane while watching everything around you descend into madness. Combat stress reaction, what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder, would likely incapacitate you within days. The constant danger, the inability to rest or feel safe even for a moment, the sights and sounds of combat, the deaths of people around you, all of these create a psychological burden that accumulates with each passing hour. You would start having difficulty sleeping, which in Stalingrad means you get no sleep at all, because sleep is already nearly impossible. You would become hypervigilant, jumping at every sound, unable to relax, exhausting yourself with constant anxiety. You would experience intrusive thoughts and flashbacks, your mind replaying traumatic events over and over, unable to process or integrate what you have experienced. Eventually you would break. Perhaps you would freeze up, unable to move or act even when action is necessary for survival, paralyzed by fear or exhaustion or simply the overwhelming nature of your circumstances. Perhaps you would break down emotionally, crying uncontrollably, or becoming catatonic, your mind simply shutting down as a protection against further trauma. Perhaps you would become suicidal, deciding that death is preferable to continuing in this hell, that ending your life is the only control you have left. Soldiers on both sides in Stalingrad committed suicide. Their exact numbers are unknown because suicides were often recorded as combat deaths to spare families the stigma, but the most likely outcome is not that you would die from any single cause but from a combination of factors, each one weakening you, making you more vulnerable to the others, until finally your body and mind simply give up. You would be wounded in combat, not seriously enough to kill you immediately, but badly enough that you need medical care. But medical care is not available, or is inadequate, and your wound becomes infected. The infection weakens you, makes you feverish and delirious. The fever prevents you from eating what little food is available, accelerating your starvation. The starvation makes you more vulnerable to the cold, and you develop frostbite. The combination of wound infection, starvation and frostbite leaves you too weak to function, unable to defend yourself when the next attack comes. You die not from any single thing but from everything at once. From the accumulation of horrors that Stalingrad represents, we have focused primarily on the soldiers, on the men who fought and died in the Battle of Stalingrad, but we must not forget the civilians, the people of Stalingrad who did not leave when they had the chance, who remained in the city when the battle began, who died in numbers that will never be accurately known because no one bothered to count them. If you were a civilian in Stalingrad during the battle, your chances of survival were even worse than those of the soldiers, because you had no training, no weapons, no organization, no one looking out for you. The civilians who remained in Stalingrad did so for various reasons. Some could not leave, were too old or too sick or too poor to evacuate. Others refused to leave, unable to accept that their city would become a battlefield, unwilling to abandon homes and possessions that represented their entire lives. Still others were prevented from leaving by Soviet authorities who needed workers to keep the factories running, who used civilians as forced labor even as the battle raged around them. These people, perhaps 50,000 or more, remained in Stalingrad and experienced horrors that in some ways exceeded what the soldiers endured. The civilians had no shelters beyond what they could improvise, no organized supply system, no medical care. They hid in basements and cellars as the city was bombed and shelled, emerging occasionally to search for food or water, risking death from snipers or artillery, or simply from being in the wrong place when a building collapsed. They had no way to distinguish between safe and dangerous areas, no military intelligence to tell them where fighting was likely to occur. They simply existed in the ruins, trying to survive day by day, hour by hour, with no end in sight. Children were among the civilians trapped in Stalingrad, orphaned when their parents were killed, left to fend for themselves in a world that had become incomprehensible. These children experienced things that no child should ever experience, saw things that would mark them psychologically for life assuming they survived. Some attached themselves to military units, became unofficial mascots or helpers, performing small tasks in exchange for protection and scraps of food. Others formed packs, groups of orphans living in the ruins, scavenging for survival, reverting to something almost feral. Many simply died, of starvation or cold or violence, small bodies found in rubble piles or frozen in the snow, mourned by no one because everyone was too busy trying to survive themselves. Women civilians faced additional dangers beyond those that threatened everyone. Sexual violence was common, perpetrated by soldiers on both sides, men who had been brutalized by combat and had lost whatever moral constraints they once possessed. These crimes were rarely reported, and almost never punished, because in the chaos of the battle, maintaining military discipline over such matters was impossible, and frankly not a priority for commanders focused on survival. The women who survived such attacks had to continue living in the same ruins, seeing their attackers regularly, unable to escape or seek justice, carrying trauma that they would never fully process or resolve. The elderly and the sick, already vulnerable, died in huge numbers. Without medicine, without adequate food, without heat, conditions that would be manageable in peacetime became death sentences. People with chronic conditions like diabetes or heart disease died quickly when insulin or medication ran out. Those who developed acute illnesses like pneumonia or appendicitis died because no medical care was available. The elderly, already fragile, simply could not endure the cold and hunger and stress. They died quietly, usually at night, their bodies discovered in the morning by those who had been too busy surviving to notice them failing. If you were a civilian in Stalingrad, your death would likely come from starvation or from being in the wrong place at the wrong time. You would have no food beyond what you could scavenge from the ruins, no organized ration system, no military supply lines. You would search through collapsed buildings looking for canned goods or grain, competing with rats and soldiers for anything edible. You would drink contaminated water from broken pipes, developing dysentery that would weaken you further. You would hide in basements during bombardments, hoping that your particular building would not be the one that received a direct hit. And eventually, more likely than not, you would die, either from slow starvation or from sudden violence, your body left in the ruins like so many others, unidentified, uncounted, forgotten. Perhaps the worst aspect of being in Stalingrad, worse than the physical suffering, worse than the immediate danger, was the knowledge. The knowledge that escape was impossible, that relief was not coming, that every day would be the same as the one before, that this hell would continue indefinitely, until you died or the battle ended, and the battle showed no signs of ending. This knowledge, this crushing certainty of your fate, would break you psychologically long before your body gave out. Modern life, for all its stresses and problems, offers hope. When things are bad, you can imagine them getting better. When you are sick, you know that medicine exists, that can cure you. When you are hungry, you know that food is available, if you can just get money or help. When you are in danger, you know that police or emergency services can help you. You have agency, options, the ability to change your circumstances, or at least to imagine changing them. This hope, this sense of possibility, is what allows most people to endure difficulty and stress. In Stalingrad, there was no hope. If you were a German soldier after the encirclement, you knew that you were trapped, that the Luftwaffe could not supply you adequately, that relief was not coming, that you would either die in the pocket, or surrender to face an uncertain fate in Soviet captivity. You knew this with absolute certainty, because the evidence was all around you: the dwindling rations, the constant cold, the shrinking perimeter, the exhaustion of your comrades. You could do the mathematics yourself, could calculate how long the supplies would last, could see that the numbers did not add up to survival. If you were a Soviet soldier defending Stalingrad, your knowledge was different but equally terrible. You knew that retreat was not an option, that behind you was the Volga, and beyond the Volga were NKVD blocking detachments with orders to shoot anyone who withdrew without permission. You knew that your commanders were willing to sacrifice unlimited numbers of men to hold the city, that your individual life meant nothing in the larger calculation of the battle. You knew that if you were wounded, medical care was inadequate, that if you were captured, the Germans would likely kill you, that your only real option was to fight until you died, or until the battle ended, whichever came first. This knowledge, this certainty of doom, would destroy you mentally. Humans can endure tremendous suffering if they believe it has meaning, if they believe it will end, if they believe their sacrifice serves some larger purpose. But when suffering appears meaningless, when it stretches endlessly into the future with no hope of resolution, the human mind rebels. You would sink into depression, into a state of resignation where you simply go through the motions of living without any real engagement with life. You would become a zombie, performing your duties automatically, but without thought or emotion, disconnected from yourself and from the world around you. Or perhaps worse, you would remain fully aware, fully conscious of your predicament, unable to escape into numbness or dissociation, forced to experience every moment of your suffering with complete clarity. You would watch yourself deteriorate, day by day, would feel your body failing, would recognize the signs of your approaching death, and you could do nothing about it, because there was nothing to be done. This awareness, this consciousness of your own destruction, would be a torture beyond physical pain, a psychological agony that would make the physical suffering almost secondary. The final truth about Stalingrad is that it ended. The battle raged from August 1942 to February 1943, and then it was over. The city was rebuilt, the dead buried or forgotten, and time moved on. But if you were dropped there without preparation or comrades, you wouldn't last a night. Stalingrad was engineered to kill, a storm of fire, cold, hunger, and despair that no individual could endure alone. Those who survived weren't heroes, just the lucky few who happened to be in the right place at the right moment. The rest, hundreds of thousands, vanished into statistics, their suffering reduced to numbers. Stalingrad became more than a battle, it became a symbol. It showed what happens when technology and ideology unite to turn war into pure destruction, when pride matters more than life. The city itself had little strategic value, yet it consumed armies and generations because symbols mattered more than reason. The lesson of Stalingrad isn't courage or glory. It's that modern war is a machine for annihilation, that civilization is fragile, and when it breaks, what remains is horror. Now the survivors are gone, the ruins rebuilt, and the memory fading. But the warning endures when memory dies. Stalingrad can happen again. So remember the cold, the hunger, the nameless dead. Remember that war is never clean, never noble. Remember Stalingrad, and never forget what it means.